What do you do when the person who hurt you refuses to change? I think that's one of the most difficult parts about forgiveness. What do you do when the person who hurt you refuses to change and they never change at all? It's one thing for them to never change, but typically this comes from a person who refuses to acknowledge that they did anything to begin with. So it's kind of like two separate issues. One is they refuse to change, but two, they refuse to acknowledge what they've done wrong. Like you don't get an apology from this type of person. They're just, or they just continue in the same behavior and blame you for the same behavior. It's your fault that you don't allow them to be destructive. So how exactly do you treat a person like this? How exactly do you forgive a person who refuses to change? Because if we're being honest, this is what makes forgiveness the most difficult. It is that, the person doesn't change. They just continue in their own destructive patterns, the ones that cause damage to me, or they refuse to acknowledge what they've done to me or to you. If a person genuinely said, "I'm sorry," then forgiveness would be a little easier than when the person decides they're not going to change at all. But how do you forgive a person who refuses to change? How do you forgive a person who refuses to acknowledge that they've done anything wrong, that keeps hurting you over and over and over with their destructive patterns? That's what I want to discuss here, because I think this is one of the quiet frustrations that Christians carry around. Because we know we're supposed to forgive. I don't think that's new information to anybody. We know that we're supposed to forgive, and we even want to forgive. I don't mean the specific situation you want to forgive, but we want to be a Christian. We want to honor Jesus. We want to follow his commands. We want to forgive in that sense. But how is it that we can forgive someone who refuses to change? Because something inside of us says, well, there's no sense in forgiving them because they're just going to do it again. They just refuse to change. So why in the world would I let this go? And that's what I want to explore. One of those quiet frustrations that we have. And I think a lot of believers are stuck right here and just don't know exactly what to do. Most of us, I think, unknowingly attach forgiveness to the other person changing. And I think that's a false dichotomy. We say in our minds, well, I'll forgive them when they change. Or since they haven't changed, I don't have to forgive them. But connecting your forgiveness to them changing is a really destructive way for you to live. It's a destructive way for you to interact with other people. Sometimes we think, well, I'll forgive them when they admit it, when they acknowledge it, or I will forgive them when they change, when their behavior changes, or I'll forgive them when they finally understand how their actions have affected me. But the question then becomes, what happens when they don't do any of that? So do I not forgive because they haven't changed? No. Forgiveness is personal. Forgiveness is between me and the Lord. Forgiveness is something that happens inside my heart, regardless of what happens in the other person's life. You see, if my forgiving another person who has wronged me depends on that person acknowledging it, then that means when that person doesn't acknowledge it, my healing or my peace depends on someone else's behavior. And that's an incredibly dangerous place to live your life, because you have essentially handed that other person your peace. And you've said, I'm going to give you my peace, and I'm going to let you have it until you change. And that disregards the nature of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a release from the offense, the release of responsibility to control that person, to make them know or change or acknowledge the wrong that they've damaged. Forgiveness is more personal in the sense that it detaches me from them and their behavior and their destructive cycles. Now, here's something I think a lot of people don't realize about forgiveness, and sometimes I think what keeps us trapped. And it's going to be kind of odd that I say this, so I want you to brace yourself. One thing that we don't realize about forgiveness, and one thing I think that keeps us trapped, is hope. I know that sounds kind of odd, but just give me a few minutes to explain it. You know, we hope that things will be different. We hope they will acknowledge the damage they've caused. We hope that they will change. We hope that one day they'll wake up and say, I'm sorry. We hope that somehow they will come to their senses and see what they've done to us. And they'll say those magic words that we're all longing for, and that is, I'm sorry. And I think that hope remains alive. And so because that hope remains alive, we stay emotionally connected to the offense. So what I want you to see here is that that hope is a misguided hope. It's a misplaced hope. Because when we're hoping for them to recognize, or we're hoping for them to change, or we're hoping that finally they'll say those words, I'm sorry, we keep replaying the conversations we've had with them in our minds. And we keep replaying the offense over and over in our minds, and we're imagining this future reconciliation, and we keep waiting and waiting and waiting because we're bartering with ourselves, saying, well, when they meet these conditions, then I'll forgive them. But some people never become who we want them to become. And forgiveness is releasing them to be who they are, instead of holding on to it, forcing them to become who we want to become. Because forgiveness begins when we stop demanding that they be different. And I think that's one of those things that keep us trapped in anger and in frustration in our relationships. This is one of the most important distinctions that I think Christians need to make when it comes to forgiveness, is forgiveness does not mean that I trust you. If you have crossed the line and betrayed me or some sort of offense toward me, forgiving you doesn't mean that I automatically start trusting you again. Trust can take years to build, and it takes moments to destroy. And so if the other person is willing to rebuild the trust, then they're going to acknowledge that they've done something wrong, sure. And that would be reconciliation, where both parties are coming together to rebuild a relationship after some kind of traumatic circumstance. But that's different than what I'm describing here. Forgiveness doesn't mean that I trust. Forgiveness doesn't mean that I reconcile with you. Forgiveness doesn't mean that I give you unlimited access to me, that I don't set up boundaries. You can completely forgive a person and still recognize that they are unsafe to be around emotionally, socially, mentally, spiritually. You can forgive a person and still recognize that there's danger. Solomon said that in the book of Proverbs, chapter 22. He said, a wise person sees danger and hides, takes refuge. So you can forgive someone and still see and recognize that they have unsafe, destructive cycles of behavior. You can forgive somebody and still set up boundaries. You can forgive somebody and still choose distance because of the destructive behaviors. Jesus taught us forgiveness, commands us to forgive, but Jesus never commanded us to be foolish. He never commanded us to be naive when it comes to the destructive patterns and behavioral characteristics of other people. Many believers, I think, carry around unnecessary guilt because they don't understand forgiveness. They think forgiveness requires, completely restoring every relationship. And forgiveness does not require restoration of the relationship. Restoration is bilateral, meaning both parties are involved. Both parties come together and work toward a resolution in their relationship. Forgiveness doesn't require the other person. It's unilateral. It's just what I do. And sometimes wisdom tells us that restoring the relationship is off limits because the other person hasn't come to terms with their damaging behavior, with their cyclical bad behavior. So my forgiveness, though, doesn't depend on their changing. And I think that's the biggest issue here, is that we're hoping that they'll change. And sure, you would hope that someone would, but what if they don't? See, if your forgiveness depends on them changing, then you may never forgive. So, like I said, Jesus taught us to forgive, and Jesus never taught us to be foolish. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't what the other person did to us. Sometimes the greatest danger to us is the pain inside of us that came from what the person did. That pain of betrayal, or that pain of resentment, or that pain of anger, that pain of frustration, that's the real danger that we have to be aware of and guard our souls against, because pain can make us cynical and suspicious and bitter and defensive and hard-hearted and cold. And that's the reason that forgiveness matters so much. Because forgiveness is personal, it's unilateral. It's about you and your spiritual well-being, you and your emotional well-being. You don't forgive somebody because they deserve forgiveness. Think about the forgiveness you got in the gospel. Did God forgive you because you deserve forgiveness? No. So you don't forgive people because they deserve it. You don't forgive people because right and wrong don't matter. Sometimes we think incorrectly about that. Like, if I forgive you, that just means that I'm saying it's okay what you did to me. But that's not why you forgive either. You forgive because your soul matters. Your spiritual health matters. And of course, that brings us back to the same point that we've been kind of exploring, and that is, am I becoming a person that I don't want to become because of something that happened to me outside of my control? Am I becoming the person that I want to become? Am I not becoming the person that I want to become? Forgiveness plays a role in that, because forgiveness, again, is unilateral. It's personal. It's something I do in my heart. It's between me and the Lord. It's not between me and the person. And the reason we forgive is because my soul matters. Unresolved resentment can make our hearts cold, and it really requires a payment, not out of the person who did something to you, But unresolved resentment requires a payment out of you because you carry it. So just think, the person did something to you, damaged you, and then by your lack of forgiving the person, you're carrying around unresolved resentment about the situation. So that's like a double whammy. One, it happened to you, and two, you're carrying it around. Well, forgiveness is the way of peace. Forgiveness is the way forward. Now, that may sound strange, but sometimes difficult people become our best teachers in life. Sometimes those difficult people, even though their behavior is unacceptable and it's destructive in many ways, those people can be used by God to reveal areas of my life in which I need to grow. God is a very kind and gracious God in this regard. And a lot of times we think about just me and the person that this happened between, instead of seeing that person as someone who is difficult and looking higher, looking to the Lord and saying, how are you using this person in my life? And it could be that he's calling you to deeper peace. But in order to get to that place, you've got to go through the hard place of forgiving and resolving the resentment by extending forgiveness to somebody who doesn't deserve it. Difficult people teach us many things, boundaries. Difficult people teach us courage. They teach us resolve. They teach us perseverance. They teach us how to depend on God. Sometimes they teach us how to stand firm without allowing hatred to take over our hearts. And, the person may never change. That's kind of what we're asking here. It's like, how do I forgive somebody who will never change? Well, the person may never change. But them changing doesn't determine whether or not you forgive, because God may have allowed that terrible situation to change you, to transform you. And oftentimes that's the deeper work that the invisible hand of God is doing in those forgiveness scenarios and relationships. I remember in Psalm 23, for example, how David says something I think is quite odd, and I don't know that many people catch on to it. But he says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not lack. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. And you go, man, this is great. It's like green pastures and still waters. This is what every human soul wants. But then you get to verse 4, and it says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. What the connection there that you need to make is, sometimes in order to get to the green pastures and the still waters, you have to go through the valleys of the shadow of death. Now, why the shepherd chooses to take us on that path, I don't know, but the purpose of that path is to develop our character, because the final purpose is to get us to the green pastures and the still waters. So difficult people can be used in that regard. Many Christians spend years trying to change other people, when in fact we should look higher than the other people. It's not the person. It's not changing them or controlling them or getting them to see what they've done to us. There's something bigger here. It could be a difficult spouse. It could be a difficult parent. It could be a difficult child. It could be a difficult coworker. It could be a difficult church member. All of these difficult people can be and are being used by God. They become, you and I, we become exhausted in life when we try to control their behavior and we try to change these people, because we're trying to do something that only God Himself can do, and that is change the human heart. And so hopefully you can see difficult people in a different light now. Now this doesn't resolve what they've done. And again, forgiveness is not extended to people who deserve it. And just because you give forgiveness doesn't mean that what happened didn't matter. But there's a bigger purpose here, a bigger purpose, and that is God's invisible hand. There's a deeper purpose here too, and that is that He's working a deeper peace within you, developing your character. So the truth is, you're responsible for obedience, to forgive. You're not responsible for the other person's transformation, for the other person to change. You're responsible for your character. You're not responsible to change their character. You're responsible for your response. You're not responsible for their choices and their responses. And this is incredibly freeing when you come to understand forgiveness like this, when you recognize the difference of what your responsibilities are and what their responsibilities are. And you resign as the one responsible for them changing. Now, at the same time, this may be the hardest part about forgiveness, because sometimes the healing it isn't just the offense. It's one thing for a person to do something to you, but sometimes what needs healing is not just what they've done to you. Maybe it's the loss that came as the result of what they did. The loss of the relationship. You had hoped for a particular type of relationship, and you now see that's not going to happen. Maybe you lost the parent that you needed. Maybe your parent didn't live up to your expectations, or maybe a child, didn't live up to your expectations. Maybe it was trust that was lost inside of a marriage. Maybe it was betrayal. The loss of what could have been. This may be the hardest part, I think, of forgiveness, because you're not saying that it didn't matter. You're not saying that it was wrong, or rather that it was okay, that it wasn't wrong. You're not saying that. You're not saying that the person deserves this. But you're trying to reconcile the loss that's taken place in the relationship. And forgiveness is the way to peace, that deeper work of God that He's working in you. And I think many people are struggling to forgive for this very reason. But they're actually struggling because they're grieving. You're grieving the loss. And sometimes accepting that someone may never change feels like death. And so that's a hard part of forgiveness, is recognizing this person may never ever change, which feels like grief. And that's a very difficult part of forgiveness. But you have to go back to the reference point. And the reference point is Jesus. Jesus forgave people who never changed. Not everyone who mocked Him repented. Not everyone who rejected Him believed. Not everyone who harmed Him became a follower. Yet He forgave. He says on the cross, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." And why? Why is that? Because forgiveness is not based on a person's future behavior. You're not forgiving them because they're going to change. You're releasing them from the offense currently while they're not changing. Regardless of whether they've said, "I'm sorry," or "I'm wrong," or "I've caused damage," you're forgiving them there. And that forgiveness is not something they deserve. And your forgiveness is not letting them off the hook. Forgiveness is about you. Forgiveness is about your peace. It's about your joy. It's about becoming the type of person whose peace and joy are not controlled by others, but your peace and your joy are controlled by God. So maybe the person who hurt you will never change. And that hurts, I know. maybe the person who hurt you will never apologize. You may wait and wait and wait, and the apology never comes. Maybe the relationship will never be what you hoped it would be or what it would become. But your freedom and your peace doesn't have to wait for them to change. Forgiveness begins when you stop making your healing depend on their behavioral change. And forgiveness, again, is between you and the Lord. And I think that's the deepest part of freedom. The deepest part that forgiveness gives you. It gives you that deeper freedom that my life is no longer contingent on someone else's behavior. That's when you, I think, reach the place where their refusal to change or acknowledge or recognize what they've done as damaging, that stops controlling you, and you are able to take control of your emotional life. Because forgiveness is not saying that what happened didn't matter. Forgiveness is deciding that what happened is not going to define you as a person and who you're going to become.